Have you ever wondered why Jesus was so quickly identified as a threat to the established power? The answer is darker than you might think. 17 messianic leaders had been systematically eliminated before him in one of the most well-organized political assassination schemes in antiquity. What I discovered about this completely changed my view of that era. Imagine walking through the dusty streets of Jerusalem in the 1st century. The air thick with the aroma of spices from the market. On every corner, whispers of prophets and possible messiahs. And at the same time, in the shadows, imperial agents monitoring every move, every word, every possible threat to the Roman system of control. These 17 men, erased from official history, but whose executions followed a frighteningly similar pattern, represented much more than simple rebels. They were key to understanding the true context in which Jesus emerged. And the way this system of elimination connects with the messianic prophecies of the Old Testament is even more fascinating. Keep watching to discover the truth that has been hidden for nearly 2,000 years. What if I told you that there was a systematic protocol for eliminating religious leaders deemed subversive long before Jesus came along? A system so effective that it eliminated 17 potential messiahs before they could gain enough influence to threaten the delicate political balance of Roman-occupied Judea. While we celebrate the life and teachings of Jesus, few know the names of those who came before him with similar messages of spiritual and political liberation, but were quickly silenced. The reason is simple and disturbing. Any charismatic figure who could unify the Jewish people posed a direct threat to the stability of the region and to the interests of Rome, setting a systematic precedent that helps explain the speed with which Jesus was targeted by the authorities. This historical revelation sheds light on biblical passages in a way I never imagined before. Interestingly, these 17 messianic leaders were not eliminated at random. There was a clear pattern to the executions that revealed a deliberate strategy. First, emerging figures who demonstrated charisma and the ability to attract followers were identified. Next, spies and informants were sent to infiltrate the disciples, gathering information about the leaders' potential vulnerabilities or statements that could be interpreted as threats to the established order. Then a process of public delegitimization was initiated, usually through accusations of blasphemy, heresy, or political unrest. Finally, after weakening his support base, physical elimination took place, usually in a public manner to set an example. This system was so well established that by the time Jesus began his ministry, the mechanisms for his elimination were already well-oiled and ready to be activated. What makes this discovery even more fascinating is that recently analyzed manuscripts reveal the names and stories of some of these eliminated messianic leaders. Figures such as Theodas of Samaria, who gathered hundreds of followers by promising to divide the waters of the Jordan, Judas ben Hezekiah, who led a revolt against Roman taxes in Galilee, and Athronges, a shepherd who proclaimed himself king and established an alternative community on the outskirts of Jerusalem. They all shared similar characteristics: humble origins, a message of spiritual renewal combined with political liberation, the ability to perform acts interpreted as miraculous, and a violent end at the hands of the authorities. The problem is that we read the Bible through a 21st century lens, often ignoring the complex political context in which Jesus emerged. First century Judea was not just any Roman province, but a political cauldron of tensions built up over centuries of foreign domination. From the Babylonian occupation, through the Persians, Greeks, and finally the Romans, the Jewish people had developed a deep tradition of messianic resistance, the belief in anointed leaders who would arise to restore Israel's independence and glory. The sophistication of this system of political control was remarkable for its time. Rome did not act alone, but through a complex network of alliances with local elites. Herod's family, the Sadducee priests of the temple, and influential members of the Jewish aristocracy all collaborated actively, motivated both by a desire to maintain their privileges and by a genuine fear that messianic revolts could lead to the complete destruction of the nation, a fear that would be confirmed a few decades later in the Great Revolt. Among the best documented cases is that of Judas ben Serapion, a Galilean rabbi who gathered hundreds of followers around 14 BCE, proclaiming the imminent liberation of Israel based on interpretations of Daniel's prophecies. His elimination is particularly revealing. First, priests were sent to debate him publicly, questioning his interpretation of Scripture. Then rumors were spread about his supposedly questionable origins and ritual violations. What makes this system even more fascinating is how it shaped the behavior of the messianic leaders themselves, creating patterns of resistance that we can clearly identify in the Gospels. Jesus was not operating in a vacuum, but was consciously responding to a system of repression that was already well established. His strategy of speaking in parables, for example, was not just a pedagogical device, but a safety technique used by several of his predecessors to avoid direct accusations of sedition. What was truly revolutionary about Jesus' approach, however, was his ability to transcend the cycle of repression and martyrdom that had consumed his predecessors. While the previous 17 messianic leaders ended in executions that effectively destroyed their movements, Jesus seems to have anticipated and incorporated his own death as a central part of his message, transforming what would have been the final triumph of the elimination system into a spiritual victory through the resurrection. Here's the detail that most scholars fail to consider. What if these 17 messianic leaders were not just victims of an oppressive system, but conscious participants in a prophetic tradition of voluntary martyrdom? The historical record reveals surprising patterns that suggest that many of these leaders not only anticipated their elimination, but incorporated it as a central part of their messianic mission. Recent analyses of fragments of apocalyptic texts from the period show an evolving understanding of the role of the Messiah. For years, I thought that these messianic leaders were naively caught up in a political system they did not fully understand, but in fact many of them were engaged in a sophisticated theological game of chess with the authorities. Consider the case of Theudas, mentioned briefly in Acts 5:36, who led his followers to the Jordan River, promising to divide it as Moses divided the Red Sea. Historians have traditionally interpreted his death as a failure. The perspective that truly transforms our understanding comes from analyzing the texts left by the followers of these messianic leaders. Strikingly, in several cases, the leader's death was interpreted not as a defeat, but as the fulfillment of prophecy and a necessary step toward future redemption. Fragmentary manuscripts found in caves near Qumran reveal prayers and hymns celebrating the purifying sacrifice of leaders who were executed. To better understand this dynamic, consider the modern internet and digital resistance movements. Just as we see today's hacker activists who deliberately expose themselves to government surveillance systems as a form of protest, sacrificing their personal freedom to expose and eventually subvert the very system that persecutes them, these messianic leaders were engaging in an ancient form of spiritual hacktivism. They were not simply being captured by a more powerful system. This reinterpretation resolves one of the greatest contradictions in early Christian scholarship: how a movement centered around an executed leader not only survived, but thrived in a hostile environment. The answer seems to lie in this long tradition of conscious messianic martyrdom that had developed robust strategies for post-martyrdom continuity. Jesus and his followers were not improvising after an unexpected execution, but operating within a sophisticated cultural paradigm. Historical documents from the Roman period show that there was in fact a specific department within the Roman administration in Judea dedicated exclusively to identifying and neutralizing messianic movements. This department, known in administrative documents as the Custodes Pacis, guardians of the peace, was composed of a network of informants, analysts of religious texts, and crowd control experts who worked closely with local authorities. One of the most striking aspects of these documents is the sophistication of the classification system used by the Romans. Each identified messianic leader was given a categorization based on his threat potential, divided into 3 levels: vox, voice, for those who merely preached without attracting large crowds; dux, leader, for those who had already established a significant following; and rex, king, for those who posed an immediate threat to Roman authority. This revelation sheds remarkable light on the passage in John 11:47-50, where the Jewish leaders gather after the resurrection of Lazarus and discuss, if we let him go on like this, everyone will believe in him, and then the Romans will come and take away our place and nation. What previously seemed like a general concern about possible Roman reprisals now turns out to be a specific fear grounded in historical experience with the Custodes Pacis department. The historical basis for these revelations comes from a combination of sources previously thought to be unrelated, but which recent research has integrated into a coherent picture. In addition to the Roman military archives themselves, preserved in collections in the Vatican and the British Museum, we have the writings of Flavius Josephus, which, although edited by later Christian copyists, contain clear references to several of the eliminated messianic leaders. The most striking thing about this system of elimination is how it continued to operate even after the crucifixion of Jesus and was later applied to the early Christian leaders. The same methods of infiltration, delegitimization, and elimination were used against Stephen, James, John's brother, and later the Apostle Paul, with the crucial difference that they now faced a movement that had incorporated martyrdom as a central part of its narrative, making it paradoxically more resistant to Roman techniques. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine yourself in the middle of the Jerusalem market in the year 23 BCE. The morning sun is already warming the city's limestone, creating a dry heat that makes your skin begin to sweat slightly beneath the rough linen garments that cover your body. The market is a hive of activity. Phoenician merchants hawking their purple-dyed fabrics, Jewish vendors offering olive oil in ceramic jars, women negotiating the price of grains and spices, the unmistakable aroma of bread baking in nearby bakeries mingles with the strong smell of spices, cumin, coriander, saffron, brought by caravans from Arabia. Amid the buzz of conversations in Aramaic, Hebrew, and Greek, you can hear more tense whispers, low voices exchanging information about a new preacher who has been drawing crowds to the Galilee region. "He heals the sick," says a woman. "He speaks with authority about the law," comments a man with a grey beard. Suddenly, the atmosphere of the market changes subtly. Temple guards, recognizable by their blue-trimmed robes and short wooden staffs, begin to circulate among the stalls. Instead of their usual pairs, they are in groups of 4 or 5, and are accompanied by a man dressed like a common scribe, but whose eyes observe everything with a calculated intensity. You have seen this pattern before. He is one of the ICTU informants who work for both the Sanhedrin and the Roman prefect. You discreetly follow this group to the less crowded part of the market, where the narrow streets begin to climb up towards the residential neighborhoods. The heat intensifies as noon approaches, causing sweat to drip down your back. The whitewashed walls of the buildings reflect the sunlight, momentarily blinding your vision. It is then that you notice another group joining the first, 2 Roman soldiers accompanied by a well-dressed civilian carrying a small writing kit. This moment you witness directly echoes the environment in which Jesus would eventually minister, highlighting the passage in Matthew 10:16-17, where he warns his disciples, "I am sending you out as sheep in the midst of wolves. Therefore be wise as serpents and harmless as doves. Beware of men, for they will hand you over to the councils and flog you in their synagogues." When the guards finally enter the house, you understand the depth of these words. This context corrects one of the biggest misconceptions about Jesus' ministry, the idea that his persecution and death were isolated events, products of unique circumstances, or simply the fulfillment of a divine plan disconnected from the socio-political reality of the time. When we understand that Jesus emerged in a context where there was already an established system of identifying and eliminating messianic leaders, his actions and words take on additional layers of meaning. Consider how this transforms our reading of passages like John 7:1-9, where Jesus refuses to go publicly to the feast in Jerusalem because the Jews sought to kill him, and later goes not publicly, but as it were in secret. Traditionally, we might have interpreted this as mere prudence or as part of the "my hour has not yet come" approach. But now we can see these actions as calculated moves by someone who fully understood the system of surveillance and elimination. A profound practical application of this historical understanding is in how we read the Passion narratives. Jesus' trials before the Sanhedrin and Pilate were not chaotic improvisations, but the execution of a well-established protocol that had been applied previously. When we study the details of these trials, the contradictory accusations, the search for two witnesses, the leading questions, the transfer of responsibility between Jewish and Roman authorities, we begin to realize that the historical and political context diminishes the spiritual and redemptive significance of Jesus' death by reducing it to a mere political event. This concern is understandable, but it reflects a false dichotomy between the spiritual and the historical that would have been alien to first-century thinking. What was truly revolutionary about Jesus' approach was precisely how he transcended this false dichotomy by fully embracing the historical, political, and cultural realities of his time. Knowledge of this system of messianic elimination and how Jesus confronted and transcended it not only strengthens our historical understanding, but deepens our faith by revealing the full extent of the incarnation. A Jesus who understands, navigates, and ultimately subverts human systems of control and oppression is a savior we can recognize as fully engaged with the complexities and injustices of our own time. This is not an ethereal Jesus who hovers above political realities, but one who understands them intimately. When we put all these pieces together, a remarkable truth emerges. Christianity emerged neither as a historical anomaly nor as a complete break with earlier traditions, but as the transformative culmination of a long evolution in messianic understanding within first-century Judaism. The Roman Herodian system of identifying and eliminating messianic leaders was not simply pursuing isolated political threats, it was unwittingly participating in an evolutionary process that tested, refined, and eventually transcended the very understanding of what it meant to be the Messiah. This messianic evolution can be traced through three major phases, each represented by some of the 17 eliminated leaders. The first phase, exemplified by figures such as Judas the Galilean and Theudas, still conceived of the Messiah primarily as a political military liberator, albeit with elements of spiritual transformation. These leaders, though eliminated by the Roman system, planted the seeds of a resistance that did not rely exclusively on military force. What this historical narrative reveals to us is how divine wisdom operates not only through supernatural interventions, but within and through human historical and political processes themselves. Far from diminishing the uniqueness and divinity of Jesus, this contextual understanding deepens our appreciation of the Incarnation as a divine engagement with human history in its entirety. Jesus not only knew about this system of elimination, he transcended it precisely by consciously incorporating it into his redemptive mission. This understanding offers a perspective that is profoundly relevant to our own time, where systems of oppression and control continue to operate under different guises. The lesson lies not only in Jesus' courage in confronting such a system, but in his radically transformative approach. He did not respond to violence with violence, nor to systemic oppression with mere passive resignation. Instead, he offered a third way that simultaneously exposed the injustice of the system and transcended its fundamental logic. So what remains for us to ask is, how does this understanding transform our own spiritual journey? If Jesus was consciously navigating and transforming an oppressive political religious system, how does this change our reading of the Gospels, and more importantly, how does it illuminate our own challenges today? Perhaps the greatest revelation is that the divine does not operate apart from historical and political complexity, but within and through it.